Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating perspective on identity, education, and how we connect with our past. The source material raises a pretty provocative argument. It claims there's a massive disconnect in our modern education system when it comes to ancient cultural roots, specifically in India. But it doesn't just point out the problem. It actually offers a highly structured four-pillar framework to fix it. So let's jump right in and look at how history shapes who we are today. All right, I've got a question for you right off the bat. Who is Panini? Take a second. Do you know? Well, the speaker in our source material actually ran a real-world test with this exact question. And they didn't just ask random students. They went straight to highly educated professionals. We're talking top-tier doctors, high-ranking tax collectors, senior bank officials. And their overwhelming response? What is a Panini? They literally had no idea. The source highlights this to point out a modern identity crisis. Highly educated folks who are completely unaware of foundational figures from their very own cultural history. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast. While local, highly educated professionals were completely drawing a blank, the renowned Western linguist Leonard Bloomfield famously stated, "No greater scholar was born on earth than Panini." I mean, Panini is globally revered as the father of linguistics. The source points out this tragic irony. Western scholars study and revere these ancient minds, while the modern local education system has somehow left its own people completely in the dark. To make sense of all this, we're going to follow a quick four-part roadmap. First up, the crisis of identity. Second, forgotten ancient scholars. Third, the four pillars of knowledge. And finally, the role of parents. Okay, let's start with part one, the crisis of identity and being disconnected from our roots. The central argument here is that the modern education journey, from kindergarten all the way to postgraduate studies, or KG to PG, completely omits foundational cultural roots. Think about it. A student can go through decades of rigorous schooling and never encounter a single lesson that connects them to their ancient history or their lineage. The source uses a really powerful metaphor for this. Water the roots and the water reaches the highest leaves. Basically, a nation's history and its cultural heritage are its roots. If you want the tree, the future generations, to thrive and reach incredible heights, you absolutely cannot ignore the root system. Knowing our historical place in the world isn't about moving backward, right? It's the vital nourishment we need to grow forward with a strong, secure identity. Which brings us to section 2, forgotten ancient scholars and the resulting knowledge gap. So what actually happens when those roots are left unwatered? Well, we forget the giants whose shoulders we stand on. The source draws a pretty sharp comparison here. On one side, we've got modern local ignorance. Because that KG to PG education system lacks heritage, generations are growing up entirely disconnected from their own legacy. But on the flip side, there's immense global recognition. The texts, grammatical frameworks, and philosophies developed in ancient India are rigorously studied in top universities all around the world. The source poses a really critical reflection here. It's a deep loss when the foundation of a nation is totally unknown to its own citizens, yet celebrated globally. To really drive this home, the speaker gives us two specific examples. We already talked about Panini, the absolute genius of linguistics, being completely unrecognized by today's elite professionals. But then, the source brings up Patanjali, the ancient sage who codified yoga. And the speaker notes a fascinating reality here. If it weren't for modern pop culture and figures like Baba Ramdev popularizing the name through consumer brands, modern generations might not know who Patanjali is either. They know the brand, sure, but not the brilliant ancient scholar behind the legacy. Okay, let's dive right into this next part. Section 3, the four pillars of knowledge. This is the proposed solution. The source suggests organizing all this ancient knowledge into a very specific, structured framework. And here is that framework clearly laid out for us, the four pillars of ancient knowledge. Number 1, Vedic literature. 2, epics and Puranas. 3, classical Sanskrit literature, and 4, philosophical and scientific shastras. The source argues that absolutely every child should have at least a foundational understanding of these four categories. So let's break down exactly what each of these pillars holds. Pillar number 1 is the vast realm of Vedic literature. Now, the source stresses that this isn't just about knowing the word Veda. It's about really understanding the structure. Like, how many Vedas are there? What are their distinct branches? Which specific Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and profound philosophical Upanishads belong to which Veda? It's like a giant puzzle. This is the absolute bedrock of ancient Indian thought, and the speaker insists that getting a basic architectural understanding of this literature is step 1 in reclaiming that cultural identity. Moving on to Pillar 2, the epics and Puranas. This includes those monumental narratives, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, along with the 18 major Puranas and 18 Upa Puranas. And the goal here isn't just to memorize their names. The source points out that true education means understanding the unique characteristics of these texts. What lessons do they actually hold? What are their core messages? These texts are literally the cultural lifeblood that have transmitted values across thousands of years. Understanding their depths is absolutely crucial. Then we have Pillar 3, which introduces us to classical Sanskrit literature. We are talking about the absolute masters of poetry and drama here, legendary figures like Kalidas, Bas, Harsh, and Magh. The speaker emphasizes that these are literary titans, but they make a really important point. We shouldn't just compare these writers to Western icons like Shakespeare. Why? Because simply comparing them completely misses the unique foundation upon which Indian literature is built. And that foundation brings us exactly to this concept, Purushartha Chatushtaya. The source explains that all ancient Indian literature, whether it's beautiful poetry or complex scientific texts, is inextricably linked to these 4 fundamental goals of human life. You have dharma, which is righteousness or duty, artha, meaning prosperity or wealth, kama, representing pleasure or desire, and finally, moksha, the ultimate goal of liberation. You really can't fully grasp Pillar 3, the classical literature, without understanding that every single story and poem was originally designed to guide humanity toward these 4 ultimate life goals. Finally, we reach Pillar 4, the philosophical and scientific shastras. This covers the incredibly vast tradition of ancient sciences, everything from astronomy to medicine, as well as some seriously complex philosophical treatises. The source notes that it's essential to understand not just what these shastras are, but how they evolved over time. This pillar is proof that this ancient culture wasn't just focused on the spiritual side of things, it actually had a highly developed, rigorous, and constantly evolving scientific tradition that mapped out the physical world too. All right, that brings us to Section 4, the role of parents and taking the reins. Because if the schools aren't teaching these 4 pillars, who will? The speaker takes a very practical, real-world stance on this. Look, it might not be in our hands to immediately go and change the entire school curriculum, but it is entirely in our hands to shape what our kids learn at home. The source uses a really great everyday example: summer vacations. Think about what happens when summer break hits. Kids are immediately enrolled in standard hobby classes, right? Dance, painting, sports. And hey, there is absolutely nothing wrong with those. But the speaker argues that we're missing a massive opportunity here. Before we send kids off to learn a new dance routine, why not organize classes that connect them to their identity? Why not create spaces where they are introduced to those 4 pillars we just talked about? The argument is super clear. Parents have a duty to take the reins and consciously introduce their children to their cultural heritage. Which leaves us with a final, pretty powerful question. What are you doing to pass on your cultural roots to the next generation? Whether you agree with the specific 4 pillars presented by the source, or you have your own unique cultural heritage to preserve, the underlying message is completely universal. Education isn't just what happens inside a classroom, it's how we transmit our identity, our history, and our values to the future. Well, I hope this explainer gave you a clear, structured look into this perspective. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this today, and I'll catch you in the next one.